Introduction. Tom Blake changed the face of surfing and has long been lauded as one of the true pioneers and innovators in the sport. Although much has been written about him and his contributions, culminating in Gary Lynch's magisterial biography of him. Tom Blake, The Uncommon Journey of a Pioneer Waterman, published in 2001. Very little work has been done on Tom Blake's Einsteinian philosophy. This is a shame, since though Blake was not formally educated, he never graduated high school due to the devastating influenza epidemic that swept the world in 1918 and 1919. He was an astute observer of nature and had a deep understanding of science and its implications on such perennial questions concerning ethics, God, and the goal of human life. The essence of Tom Blake's philosophical outlook is best captured in his book, Voice of the Atom, an engaging narrative that centers on his conversations with a young nomadic wanderer named Anthony. Yet, there are also other scattered writings, particularly letters that he wrote to friends over the years, that provide a wider glimpse into Blake's thinking that are invaluable. Tom Blake was not a man of many words, but what he did write, occasionally in terse and epigrammatic phrases, are pregnant with meaning. As such, they offer us a tantalizing clue behind this enigmatic man, who in the course of a somewhat lonely existence influenced the lives of millions who mimicked Tom Blake's lifestyle, even as they remained oblivious to his reasoning behind it. This book is an attempt to better understand Tom Blake's outlook on life, which is much more than simply an ocean lifestyle, although that too plays a dramatic and elemental part. To accomplish this aim, I have decided to focus primarily on Blake's own words, attempting the best I can to unpack some of his more compacted thoughts and ideas. Calling this a surfer's philosophy may at first give some pause, since for many surfers are perceived as a motley crew more bent on partying than on philosophizing. While some of that stereotype is true, and some of it in a very positive sense, a larger purview shows that focusing on the ocean and what it has to offer is an illuminated pathway to gain some hard-earned wisdom about the vagaries of life. While it is impractical and misleading to pigeonhole all surfers into a certain type, there are, nevertheless, some core elements that appear common across the surface. First and foremost is a love for the simple act of riding waves. Whether short or long boarding, whether bodyboarding or body surfing, the list of wave-riding vehicles is indeterminate. Second, and this is where philosophy plays a part, surfers have tended to adopt a different kind of lifestyle than most, one that is invariably dependent on the ocean's ever-changing tides, moods, and conditions. A dedicated surfer has to be open to fleeting moments and be ready within hours, if not minutes, to change course lest he or she miss out on a glassy session, offshore winds, or a peaking swell. In other words, a surfer has to be attuned to the present moment and keenly aware of how previous swells operated and of potential future trajectories, keeping in mind the fundamental physics of position and momentum. Take, for example, how a Southern California surfer must navigate an energy pattern that first emerged 10 days prior off the coast of New Zealand. As the winds hit 60 miles per hour or more across a vast area of sea, waves emerge and do their rhythmic march to distant lands, getting groomed and more properly defined during the march. Imagine you are sitting atop your board at 56th Street at Newport Beach waiting for a set to reach just beyond the jetty. Two things have to be in harmony: your position and your momentum. You have to coordinate your surfboard with the incoming wave and time it just right. If you are too far in or out, or worse, too far behind the bowl, that unique pattern of cresting water molecules will explode its pent-up energy across the sandbar and you will shake your head in regret, unless there is another one outside. A surfer is a water physicist. If he or she is not, then riding a wave is not possible. Granted that the surfer in question may not know the mathematical equations underlying why ocean waves form, such as wave energy = wind speed x, wind duration x, fetch distance. But experientially, she must bodily adapt as if such laws were written in her muscular memory. Tom Blake was a scientist of surfing and, as such, took a very empirical approach to the subject. This led him to all sorts of remarkable innovations that allowed him more freedom in the ocean than what was thought possible. Within the limits of his time period, fiberglass, though invented as glass wool in the early 1930s, had only become commercially viable until much later. Tom Blake utilized what Stuart Kauffman has insightfully called the adjacent possible. Ever observant and with a remarkable eye for detail, Blake applied his extensive knowledge of the ocean and available building materials to create the hollow surf and paddleboard, waterproof camera housing, a prototypical sailboard, a surfboard with a built-in keel, skeg, fin, and such lifeguarding rescue devices as the torpedo buoy and rescue ring. Blake was also a champion swimmer and waterman, winning the swimming world record in the 10-mile open in 1922, the Pacific Coast surf riding in 1928, and the Catalina paddleboard race in 1932. But far beyond these accomplishments, Blake established a lifestyle around the sea that focused on what was ultimately important in life, perhaps best epitomized by his famous quip, "Lessen the overhead." Tom Blake lived a non-conventional life, married once for a short period, had no offspring, and never really settled down until his final years back in his state of birth, Wisconsin. Yet this most remarkable of men, by pursuing an oceanic vision, has transformed the lives of millions, not merely by his words, but precisely how he chose to live. For surfers around the world today are, to some measure, the lineal descendants of Tom Blake's ideas, encompassed as they were by a life fully lived, where the guiding principle is perhaps best summarized by an old Hawaiian proverb: "Never turn your back to the ocean." Atomic spirituality. Science has proved that each atom with its mass and energy system is a complete unit of nature, with all the divine attributes, sustaining power and intelligence found in all substance, in all things. Thus, the atom may be usefully defined and thought of as a part of God, with the energy force of nature, or God. Humanity reacts to this force. As man is but an aggregation of atoms in molecular form, the atom becomes man's ultimate identity. The order, rhythm, harmony, and power of the atom are identified as man's rightful deeds. The voice of the atom tells us God is part of everything, part of one God, one universal nature. Tom Blake, Voice the Atom. Chapter 2, Paragraph 2. A scientific view. It is obvious in reading Voice of the Atom that Tom Blake was deeply influenced by Albert Einstein's theories, particularly his groundbreaking 1905 paper entitled, "Does the Inertia of a Body Depend Upon Its Energy Content?", which explains the equivalence of mass and energy in the famous equation E equals sine mc2. Later, Blake would summarize this law of physics simply as nature equals sine God, which he later permanently etched in sandstone overlooking his favorite bay. Interestingly, Blake's pantheism dovetails with the brilliant 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza, who argued in his magnus opus Ethics, demonstrated in geometrical order, that there was one universal substance permeating throughout the universe such that, although each particular thing be conditioned by another particular thing to exist in a given way, yet the force whereby each particular thing perseveres in existing follows from the eternal necessity of God's nature. Blake defines God's nature via atomic theory, explaining that scientists now agree that the atom consists of many states of being. They have proved that while the mass and energy of the atom change identity, it does not disintegrate into nothing. While Tom Blake does employ religious language, particularly when talking about God, his definition of a supreme power is much more radical and heretical than what most Christians would accept. For instance, Blake doesn't believe that Jesus resurrected from the dead, but instead holds that logic, reason, and science have established that no man truly dead has ever returned to a living state of being. Blake theorizes that Jesus Christ didn't actually die on the cross per se, but rather that he only appeared to expire and was later revived by his friends and because of this was able to walk out the tomb. Whether this is historically true or not is still up for debate since we simply don't have enough information to make any absolute judgments, except, of course, if one is a dogmatic believer or skeptic. But the key underlying point that Blake was driving at has less to do with the specific question of Jesus' purported resurrection, but with the much larger issue of how to explain miracles in an age of science. To this, Blake provides a telling example, analogizing that if we ventured back 1,000 years ago and saw a jet plane flying overhead, we would think of it as a miracle and be perplexed by its existence. But that was only because we didn't understand the exact science and mechanics behind why a jet of such weight could fly so fast through the air. Simply put, there was nothing supernatural about it, even though we remain impressed by it technological wizardly. As Arthur C. Clarke, author of 2001: A Space Odyssey, quipped, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." On this score, Blake and Clarke see eye to eye, and thus Blake clearly concludes, "Therefore we must deny the preconceived notions of miracles." Blake envisions a much different Christianity and a much different interpretation of what Jesus Christ actually did. As Blake opines, "No man, and Jesus was a man, has ever or ever will appear in a living state after dying. That would be in the realm of the supernatural, or an unnatural concept, which was disproved by Einstein in his mass-energy equivalence assessment of things." Blake goes on to argue that all such miracle stories relating to Christ are mere embellishments that detract from the deeper message of compassion for those less than ourselves. Blake even suggests that the resurrection accounts of Jesus may have been doctored by later scribes. The truth is obscure, and the events after the crucifixion may well have been the combined effort of the scribes, who recorded their views long years, an estimated 40 or more, after his death, to create the ideal man of compassion that millions of humanity have had faith in, down through the centuries and even today. For Blake, there is an underlying unity behind nature, and he doesn't want to speak of a God that requires a belief in something transmundane. He approvingly quotes Emerson, who writes, "Truth is the summit of being." And upon this, Blake adds, "The atom, nature, God, and morality equal truth, the first-class way to go." Blake clearly champions a scientific way of thinking over naively believing in religious mythology, arguing that truth, rather than myth, should be established, and as I said before, computerized and available when needed. In The Voice of the Atom, which centers on his dialogue with Anthony in the desert, who represents an idealized Christian trying to imitate the life of Christ, Blake wants to persuade his young acquaintance that with more time and consideration, many of the old and outdated rules of Orthodox religion will fall away as superstitious nonsense. While he doesn't necessarily advocate free love, Blake sees sex in a much more normal light and admonishes his young friend, who wants to be celibate, to think more reasonably about the subject. Blake realizes that humans are evolved to procreate, and in a very telling aside comments, "Lonely in middle age and old age is the man who fathers no children and especially sad, the woman who fails to fulfill her nature in this respect." Dovetailing with his fellow religionists who believe in eternal life, Blake too suggests that we live eternally, but it is not what one usually imagines. Instead of a bodily resurrection into heaven or a voyage into uncharted astral planes, Blake focuses on Einstein's theories concerning the interchangeability of matter and energy, where he exclaims, "Emphatically, yes, we do continue to exist by the compulsive laws of nature and God, by changing back into the atom kingdom as a necessary and useful part of nature or God. When we die, we are not turned out of the universe, merely return to the good earth, to our original atomic state, more peaceful, stable, and harmonious than stressful human state." Blake envisions this way of thinking as liberating, and in this purview he dovetails with such luminaries as Goethe, Emerson, Nikola Tesla, Carl Jung, Walt Whitman, Heraclitus, and Lao Tzu, among many others. For Blake, nature is not a problem as such, but the very essence of our existence, and necessitates that we understand its vagaries. Look carefully enough and the deep mysteries of life unravel themselves. Since whatever the universe is, so are we. There is no duality in Blake's worldview, just confused misapprehensions by humans who are not observant and honest enough to confess the obviousness that surrounds us. Blake realizes that some may not agree with his positive spin concerning the afterlife, but he is nothing if not optimistic when he writes, Embrace the sublime and comforting concept of being reincarnated into a useful and grand eternal atomic state of being, our true and rightful, and I might add, inevitable heritage, and where all is well.